everyone, and welcome back to Inside College Admissions, a Scoir podcast. We're excited for you to join us today for another conversation in our Deans of Admission series. You'll hear from our guests about the fall semester during a pandemic, the admissions process, how schools are adapting, suggestions and advice for families, and much more. Our strategic advisor, Peter Van Buskirk, will guide us through the conversation today with our special guest. Now over to Peter for today's interview.
Welcome to Inside College Admission, conversations with admission leaders about matters affecting the college-going process. My name is Peter Van Buskirk. Earlier this year, I was able to chat with 20 deans of admission about the challenges posed to their institutions by the emerging coronavirus. Today, I'm pleased that Mike Steidel, Dean of Admission at Carnegie Mellon and longtime friend, has been able to break away from his credential review to join us and discuss how the last 8 to 10 months of COVID have affected the admission operation at Carnegie Mellon. So welcome, Mike.
Thanks, Peter. It's great to be with you again. I hope all is well with all of your listeners too.
Absolutely. Well, I'm just wondering, does it seem like it's been 9 months since we talked last, or 9 years?
You know, in some ways it seems like 9 years, and in other ways it seems, in the blink of an eye. And in terms of how much had to be accomplished in such a short amount of time, it's been a race. There's no doubt about that.
Well, what do things look like in your shop right now? I would imagine you're up to your ears in applications, reviewing that. Have you missed a beat there? Are things looking like you would expect them to look?
In some ways, the reading season is perhaps the most normal that we felt in quite some time. We typically read applications at home and then, preparing for committee. And so this is the read at home stage. And this feels very, very familiar. Mm-hmm. And so it's good to be on some ground that feels very familiar because in reality, nothing really has felt very familiar since March until about now. So I'm welcoming this season. And even though reading season is a very hectic season, I'm welcoming it as something that feels very familiar to us.
Excellent. Well, let's backtrack just a bit. I would imagine that coming out of the spring, there had to be some nervousness about what the entering cohort would look like in September. I think there was a lot of optimism that things would work out and students would show up, but there was also some unspoken concern that maybe students wouldn't show up. So we wouldn't know what the class would look like until September. How did that all work out for you guys?
Yeah, it worked out very well, actually. In some ways, a bit surprising. We ended up being a bit heavier and overshooting our target by some. We actually took about, I would say, 10% of our normal losses over the summer and added an additional 10% to that. In recognizing, we called it the COVID cushion. And, we didn't need all of it. And so we over-enrolled by about 25, 30-ish in that range. We had a decent number of defers, as you could imagine. But in preparing for the normal losses plus this COVID cushion, we ended up in a pretty good place. And so, we're very, very fortunate in that regard.
Now, those who came in September, were they all coming as full-time residential, or did you need to do some remote work with them?
Yes. So the way we worked our residence halls, everyone got a single, and they went to first years as first priority. Mm-hmm. And so we were only able to accommodate roughly about half of the first years in the first semester. So the term for first-year residence housing this year was only a semester. So those that came in the fall packed their bags at Thanksgiving and won't be returning as residential students in the spring. And we'll be welcoming a whole different cohort of residential students in the spring, so that all of our first years will have at least been on campus if they were able to be on campus and if they chose to be on campus for one semester.
Excellent. Excellent. So, and do you sense going forward into fall of 2021, is there a likelihood of quote unquote normalcy at that point, or are you still prepared for all possible contingencies?
Yeah, I think it's the hope is becoming brighter, to be honest with you, for return to some kind of more near normalcy. We're expecting that there's still going to be some mitigation efforts that will have to be in place because of the virus. Certainly, we're now having conversations about, is vaccination going to be a prerequisite to being on campus? So that's going to be resolved, I think, soon. And, depending upon how quickly the vaccine becomes available widely in the population will determine, how quickly we can return to normal. But right now, Carnegie Mellon is a distribution center for the vaccine for students. And so we're looking forward to essentially a fall that more closely resembles a normal fall than we've had in the past.
That's good. Now, I would imagine too, with your team emerging from your first round of credential review and early decision, did you notice anything different this year? Where was there more reluctance about early decision because kids couldn't get to campus? Are things kind of looking normal, better than normal?
Actually, better than normal, but I do think that we're up about 20% in our earlies, and which is a high number. And we think, quite frankly, some of it due to the fact that, there is no SAT requirement. And so we're SAT optional, ACT optional for first year admission this year. So we think that fueled some of the growth for early. It's certainly fueling some of the growth that we're already seeing for regular decision as well. About 60% of our applicants to date are saying use my scores, about 40% aren't, asking us not to use scores. And so the decision rests with them. And they can change their minds up until decision release.
Do the different colleges within the university have different expectations with regard to scores, or is this a carte blanche? Everybody has the test option.
Carte blanche. I think what we're experiencing, though, is depending upon the college, the percentages are pretty different. So as you can imagine, in fine arts, it's almost the reverse. Only 40% are saying use my scores, and 60% are saying don't use my scores. And in some of our more technical programs, it's just the opposite. So it's very interesting to follow those percentages, but they aren't uniform across all of our colleges.
Sure. So what's it like now? I mean, you've been including scores in your review process for years, and now for 40% plus of the students who apply, you look in that spot where the scores should be on the form, and it's not there. How's that working for you right now?
To be honest with you, I think we had a lot more anxiety than we probably should have had going into it, recognizing that, it's still easy to spot really terrific kids. And so I think that while scores may have helped us sort, I think without scores, it really causes us to perhaps dive more thoroughly into context and understanding context of the applicant. But, given a thorough understanding of context, the decisions aren't all that difficult to make. And so we know that, some of the work in front of us is this time next year at the conclusion of the first semester of our first years, we're going to do the due diligence to say, is there any significant difference in the performance of those that, applied with scores versus those that applied without scores? If we've done our job well, there won't be much statistical difference between the two. If not, there's obviously something that we need to learn in order to go forward. But, I think that this is a great study that all colleges and universities are in for, that are, SAT optional for the first time. Is there any statistical difference between the two groups?
Sure. You said something about context and trying to understand students' performance. Could you elaborate on that a little bit more and help us understand what variables get a little more attention now than perhaps might have gotten before?
Yeah, I think, to be honest with you, it's caused us to really dig into the profile much more deeply than we have had in the past.
This is the profile of the high school?
Exactly. Yep. So it's first of all, to see what coursework is offered, what advanced coursework is available, the students' choices within that, how the school has pivoted as a result of COVID-19, and what we need to consider as it relates to looking at a transcript. So it's almost as if we have to look at school transcripts now with a different lens and a better sensitivity, given the fact that even those schools that we're very familiar with, they've had changes, they've had to change, they've had to adjust. And so understanding how they've accommodated students in the midst of the pandemic has really been helpful in informing what we should consider in making these admission decisions.
And speaking of context, because the spring semester ended like a fire drill with nobody coming back, are you expecting more concrete information from students academically in the fall, even before looking at an early decision outcome?
Yeah, it's certainly, particularly for, many schools did go pass fail for the second semester. And so, we're eager for, any kind of indication as to how those grades look in this half of the year. And so some of the students that have applied early decision have already sent us, first rating periods worth of grades, just to, essentially confirm that they're still on track and, things are progressing as you would expect. And so it just alleviates a lot of the question that comes, when trying to make admission decisions. And the only thing that you've got is, essentially a completed 10th grade year and just the first half of the 11th grade year without much more. You can understand the uncertainty of making, those kinds of choices. And so schools have been great, to be honest with you, in helping us understand that the performance levels of these students really remains very much unchanged, and in fact, for many cases, really admirable in the face of, rapid change, rapid adjustment, and, the continued back and forth in terms of, we're in school this week, we're not in school next week, and, we're hybrid the week after. And my heart goes out to schools that are trying to essentially achieve some kind of normalcy in the midst of such tremendous upheaval.
Part of the context, I would imagine, can come from the students themselves. And I know that Carnegie Mellon not only uses the common application that has an essay, a standard essay, and now there's a COVID essay option, but you also have a number of optional essays too. What are you trying to discern about the student through that combination of essays that you look at?
Well, I think certainly as it relates to the common applications COVID question, we're trying to better understand what the students' perception of how they've been affected by the pandemic has really meant to them, and what they want us to understand about how they've had to make adjustments in their either academic experience or, as it relates to the desire to test, but the inability to test. It really is very open-ended in terms of anything that they want to share with us, not really meant for evaluation as much as it really is help us, put on the right lens to look at your application. And so those essays have been really helpful, to be honest with you. Our normal essays really are much more about trying to discern from the student essentially a number of things that we look for, typically much more, I would say, character attributes that are related to persistence and success. And so some of those are performance attributes, some of those are ethical characteristics. But, essentially, I think, there are signs that, students reveal about those characteristics, whether or not they know of them. They definitely reveal themselves through essays and through recommendations, which really help us, develop confidence that we're on the right track in making a positive decision in these cases.
Excellent. Well, we'll move off of the credential review here in a moment, but I'm curious, what does your gut tell you about the future of testing? Because prior to this year, roughly 1,000 colleges and universities were test optional. Now, because of COVID, that number's grown by approximately 60%. That's a pretty big swing. Some people would suggest that that's the beginning of the death knell for testing or standardized testing. Others are saying, well, not so fast.
It could be. I think the thing that will give us confidence is, at this time next year, looking at, is there a significant difference between those that we admitted with scores and those that we admitted without scores? And to be honest with you, as I said earlier, it's still really easy to spot good kids, whether or not they have tests. And so I will say this, in honesty, my own confidence is growing, that, we can definitely make these decisions without tests. And so clearly in a data-rich institution such as ours, we want the data to back up the gut level feeling. But I think that, if we're doing our jobs, the right way and are keyed in on the right attributes, I don't really sense that there's going to be much of a disparity between those admitted with tests and without.
There's a little bit of a footnote on the testing situation too, and that is that for years, institutions, and I'm sure Carnegie Mellon's been a part of this too, have used students' testing experience as part of the lead generation process. If fewer students take tests, fewer names are available to you. Have you begun to wrestle with that possibility that you need to kind of rethink how lead generation begins, how you open up the top end of your funnel, or are you well ahead of the curve on that?
In some ways, fortunately, we've been backing off of searches, buying names based on standardized testing results.
Mhm.
And so we have, really gotten ourselves to the point where we buy very little
Mm.
compared to the days 10, 15 years ago where we bought, over 100,000 names. We're definitely not even half that now. And, using search in a much more targeted way. And to be honest with you, I think a lot of it has really gotten for us to the point where we're not so concerned about students that find their way into the applicant pool as stealth applicants.
Mhm.
We recognize that there are many ways to learn about colleges and universities today, and that we're not the only source of the right information. And so students are finding access to lots of information in order to help them make decisions about whether or not to apply. So we basically tried to stop stressing about how large our inquiry file is and how many students we're searching. It's not like every message that a student receives about a college today has to come from the college itself. So we want to be, in the right places in terms of working with organizations that provide content to students like Scoir and like others that provide great services to students in terms of information. Yeah, we want to be in those places. But do we have to be the source of inquiry generation? No, not necessarily. And so we've let go of that and don't really mind that, over half of our applicants today are stealth. That's great. And, quite frankly, if they're getting the right information on their own to learn about the institution, so be it. And we basically stopped stressing about it. We don't collect inquiry cards anymore. We just are out there as information providers more than anything else.
Yeah, what's an inquiry card? I mean,
Exactly. Yeah.
that betrays our own generational roots in
Yeah.
this.
Yeah.
But speaking of that, how has your staff been able to pivot in terms of maintaining the connection? Because I would imagine there are a lot of young people and their parents who feel dislocated from the colleges over the last 8 to 10 months. Yet, given the numbers you mentioned earlier about your applicants so far, it seems seemingly a lot of folks have found you regardless, and you found them. How has that worked?
Well, it's so interesting. I mean, there certainly was an initial period of shock in that, we can't do business the way we normally do. But after that wore off, recognizing, I think our first response was we've got to try to create online what we could do in person.
Mhm.
And then we recognized we can pretty much let ourselves off the hook to try to do that effectively and really try to take advantage of what the crisis brought us in the way of opportunity, to be creative and to do things that we've never tried before, and to ultimately, try to provide access to students to information that we've not really thought about before.
Mhm.
And so, the creative side of this began to really show with the kind of programming and the kind of engagement that we were able to do in a much more, I think, interesting way than just going out there and giving the dog and pony show, if you will, about, what college is like. And the fact that we recognize the opportunity for repeat customers. And, we don't have to tell the whole story all at once. We can spin the story over time in, segments.
Mhm.
So that, students don't have to commit much more than 15 or 20 minutes at a stretch, because we recognize the weariness that comes with Zoom.
Mhm.
And so don't want to keep students, sitting there while we drone on and on and on. So these sessions have really been opportunities to be short and concise and creative on topics that are relevant to students. Some of it focused on Carnegie Mellon, some of it just focused on the process itself. And it's really energized our folks. And quite frankly, I think we've had better interactions with students this way, versus the old way of doing business. And so it'll be interesting to see, how we balance both when, the world does return to a more sense of normalcy, and, travel is now kind of part and parcel of what we do. How will we continue to sustain the efforts that we've developed over this last year? And, can we back off of some of those in-person opportunities that we felt like we had to do for the sake of reaching a much broader audience with more creative ways to reach them?
Well, interestingly, it would seem that distance recruiting is facilitated through what you're working on now, and the virtual recruitment. I know that you've done a lot of overseas recruitment, but it's still hard to be in all places at one time. But now you can be accessible to anyone, anywhere in the world at a keystroke.
Exactly. Yeah. It's been really wonderful. And even connecting with counselors. We've done coffees with, counselors periodically throughout the time during COVID. And, we've connected with counselors in ways that we've never been able to connect with counselors in the past. So I think that, yes, the pandemic is a crisis, and yes, it's caused a lot of upheaval, but it's also provided a lot of, opportunity to rethink how we interact and engage with each other, and certainly appreciate the time when it comes when we can see people again in person.
Mhm.
And recognize and perhaps not take that so much for granted as we had in the past.
Well, absolutely. But I think there's some justifiable concern, however, that in the current scheme of things, there's a population that's being missed. I mean, those folks who have access to the technology, who might have some predisposition toward higher education, et cetera, are probably connecting very well and very quickly with you. But those folks who are otherwise marginalized, who might not have the same access to technology, good counseling, et cetera, are arguably perhaps cast adrift here. How do you see Carnegie Mellon and higher education in general maintaining the kind of momentum that I thought we had with those students prior to the pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt about it. I think those populations definitely need special attention and special effort. And we have tried to essentially devote some of our time to reaching them,
Hmm.
mostly with information about the process, whether it be admission or financial aid, and how to prepare ultimately course wise, and then ultimately what about the application components? How do you do a college search? What about financial aid? And I hope we're having success. We're certainly seeing students in this realm. If there's any hope at all, it's looking at some of our common application numbers and recognizing we're up in first gens, we're up in students that have requested fee waivers, we're up in some of our underrepresented populations. And so there's encouraging signs that even though there may be disparity in terms of access,
Hmm.
we're certainly seeing some positive signs that we're able to reach some, and ultimately the numbers are starting to bear that out. But we're certainly watching what Common Application is reporting in terms of those challenges associated with first gen and lower socioeconomic students as it relates to Common Application completion. No doubt about it. And I think that they've been sounding the alarm now for several months about how that population is just not applying at the same level they had in prior years. But I can tell you so far, that's not been our experience. I don't know that it's attributed directly to our efforts, but I think that it's an encouraging sign nonetheless. But I do agree with your point that these populations, whether in person or remote, need special focus, special attention, and special thought about how we can increase their access to higher education.
Absolutely. Regardless of one's background or orientation to college, cost and affordability are still front of mind for many. And even for those who 2 years ago may have felt like it cost a lot, but we can manage this. Then COVID hits and the economy starts to do some things that don't feel very good. So they do as they're told. They get the FAFSA on October the 1st. They fill it. Oh, how can we fill this out? It's looking at our 2019 tax return. And that's not the reality that we're facing today. Do you get many conversations like that with families that are just perplexed about how to represent to you and to others the reality of their current financial circumstance rather than the 2019?
Yeah, the special consideration process is a formalized one at Carnegie Mellon, where, if a family is experiencing a reduction in income from the tax year that they used to complete their FAFSA and profile forms, it's a process that we can use to take them through first an initial package of aid and then a revised package of aid based on some of the forecasts for reduction. I mean, it's a challenge, and some of it comes with professional judgment in these cases. Some of it is ultimately working with the family closely to make sure that they're not over or underestimating the resources that will become available at the end of the tax year. So there's certainly some uncertainty associated with special consideration processes, But I think in general, institutions want to help families
Mhm.
through this difficult time and recognize that, there's got to be some flexibility that's on us to build into our own processes to make sure that we're helping families through what is, perhaps one of the most challenging times in our lifetime.
That's well, absolutely. Uh, and Mike, I'd like to check your thoughts on something a little bit different right now. Carnegie Mellon's had a long-standing reputation for excellence in athletics as well. And there are a lot of young people right now who in high school would be competing in winter sports who can't. And there are a lot of coaches on Division III campuses who would like to be recruiting students. What are you observing about the manner in which the Division III athletic program is able to function with recruitment this year?
It's interesting because, the coaching community is a pretty well connected community. And so even though, many of these athletes have not been able to participate, on the field or in the pool or on the track in this cycle, the coaches in secondary schools and the coaches associated with CBOs around the country definitely still know their athletes.
Mhm.
So our coaches rely on their connection with, high school coaches and coaches from community-based organizations that, ultimately are helping kids that are aspiring to be athletes in college. And so, interestingly, so far in the early decision slate that we looked at for athletics, it was just as large as it was last year. We're not seeing, any disparity in numbers so far in terms of recruited athletes. I think if this would continue on for another year or so, there may be some high school coaches that may not be aware of the athletic talents of the students coming through. But, these students that are seniors this year were juniors last year. And for many of them, they did have the fall season and even part of the winter season to finish. And so, I think we're lucky in that we're relying on the coach to coach contact in terms of helping students that want to be varsity athletes at the collegiate level.
In some ways, in a non-religious manner, this is still faith-based recruitment, though,
Yeah,
because
to
you have
some extent. Yeah.
faith in that connection with the coach. I remember when I was in your role, the coaches were pretty steadfast in saying that, well, we just can't recruit somebody unless we've seen them play. And now they have to operate on some degree of faith. Well, when you think about the better days, when we move past COVID and folks are able to experience life as we've known it for a long time, what about your operation do you think is likely to stay? I mean, there's been a lot of innovation born out of necessity. How much of what you find yourself doing out of necessity this year do you think is going to be there, a couple of years from now?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, in honesty, we're asking ourselves a lot about that. I don't know that we'll have the full story until we've had, an opportunity to be on the other side and look back and say, what have we learned, and what's valuable in keeping and what's not. I recognize, the whole remote recruitment piece has been, I think, a valuable experience for all of us to go through. And recognizing that we can't just recreate what we would do in person. We have to rethink the constraints of, how we deliver information about colleges and universities, what kind of relationships students want to have in the remote space, what they're willing to give us in terms of time and attention, how parents want to be involved. I think that it's wonderful in that it has been a tremendously great opportunity to be creative with the complexity and the constraints of COVID. When you remove that, I would suspect that there's going to be a lot that we'll continue on with. I think the challenge will be, how do we balance it with the return to the in-person experience, whether it be on our campus and kids and their families coming to campus, or going out from campus and expecting to interact with students and their families at their locations and not ours. Time will tell, and I think that in some ways there may be less willingness to do things in person when literally they recognize the value of doing it remotely and perhaps saving the in-person experience for when they're admitted. It's all conjecture at this point, But I think the world is going to be changed, and we have to be at least really on our toes to decipher what's really important in this new world and how we make those adjustments to continue the efforts that have been helpful and useful and effective, and what can we literally stop doing because the world has turned and what we do in that space is no longer effective. So it's a tremendous opportunity for us. There's no doubt about that.
Absolutely. Well, and a new world, to use your terms, indeed, which means that there are still a lot of families who have had some connection with the college going process. Either mom or dad went to college, older brother, sister, etc. And now suddenly it looks a lot different. As we wrap things up here, what might be one or two questions or thoughts you would pass along to that family that is now quite perplexed with how do we approach this animal that doesn't look like the process that we knew in the past? What should people be thinking about and concerned about as they enter into the decision making with college?
Yeah, I think the good thing is that there's a tremendous amount of resources that are available that didn't exist before. We had to create them.
Mm-hmm.
And as a result, I don't think those are going to go away. I think that those resources, whether they be synchronous or asynchronous, they're out there. And quite frankly, I think the challenge for them is that the challenge isn't that there's not enough resources. I think the challenge is, how do I digest the mountain of material that is out there and not be paralyzed by, oh my gosh, how do I start?
Mm-hmm.
And some of that, is obviously, we're reaching out to families to say we're here, if we can help. And, some of it is trying to establish a relationship and a point of trust in terms of helping students through the process. But for those students who may be from more challenging situations, challenging backgrounds,
Mm-hmm.
challenging circumstances, I mean, there are CBOs to help, community-based organizations to help, certainly school counselors, if they have the bandwidth to help students in these situations, I think, are worth their weight in gold in terms of helping students through the mountain of resources to find the ones that'll be most appropriate for them in navigating the space. So I think, if anything, we've gone from a place where, this population may have been overlooked, and now, there's this tremendous amount of information that's been, essentially developed for all. And, for those that are maybe the uninitiated in this process, it's where do I start digesting it all, and how do I gain access to what's most important to me? And that might be the biggest challenge of all.
Dive in. Don't hesitate, right?
Exactly.
I remember what that was like as a kid learning how to swim. Diving in was always a challenge, but once in the water, things tended to work out pretty well.
Well, it's, for us, for you and I, it was that bag of college materials underneath the bed. And it's just like, oh my gosh, I got so much stuff. Where do I start?
Exactly.
And in many ways, now it's not hiding under your bed. Now it's all online. Now it's like, okay, where do I find it and how do I gain access to it? But it's there.
And how do I make sense of what I got? That's right.
Exactly.
Mike, this is great. I've always enjoyed talking with you about the process because you and your colleagues at Carnegie Mellon have been standard bearers in terms of developing information and creating process for the rest of us. So thanks for taking some time today to share your perspective on what's happening. I trust that this will be very helpful to the people who listen in. I wish you the very best. I hope you stay safe.
Well, thank you, Peter. It's always a pleasure. I really enjoyed our conversation, and I wish all of your listeners good success in the college admission process as it unfolds for the remainder of this time.
Absolutely. Well, be safe, everybody. Take care.